Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you, as ever, from the Messy Time Studios on the beautiful beaches of the last free state in America, Florida. It is the 9th of January, 2025, and I'm joined today by Rod Eggert, who's a mineral economist at the Colorado School of Mines. I've gotten to know over the years through the Critical Minerals Institute and other ventures in mining. So, Rod, thank you for taking the time to come on.
Well, Christopher, thank you very much for having me. It's great to talk with you today. We've had light snow here, so but the sun will be out in a few minutes and make it another beautiful day in Colorado. Uh, I think probably the topic of mineral resources is more in the public eye now than at any time in my professional career. And while I like to think that I'm still a youngster, it's not true. And it's a confluence of, I would say, two things. First of all, geopolitics and national security concerns about availability of mineral-derived raw materials for military preparedness and essential civilian needs in times of a national emergency. And second of all, the concerns about availability of resources for emerging energy technologies as technologies evolve and change. And I don't propose that we get into a debate about
No, 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 I'll kick us off. Maybe
energy transitions and so on and so forth. We can talk.
that could be like a sore tooth topic depending on who you're talking to.
No, that's right. But let me just say that the one other thing that the national security issue is really about a lack of diversity in the geography of existing supply chains. Whereas the new energy technologies and their demands for more copper and more lithium and more nickel and more cobalt, that's less about lack of diversity in existing geography of production and more about will supply keep up with demand in ways that allow our mineral resources to be affordable, secure, and produced in environmentally responsible and socially responsible ways.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think a good touch point would be um, my contribution, for what it's worth, to world political theater was Greg Barnes and I, who he was the founder of Tambreez, and I was the CEO of Tambreez, which is the rare earth deposit in Greenland. Visited the White House in mid 2020, and hard on the heels of that discussion, President Trump offered to buy Greenland. So we had this great meeting with the National Security Council and a bunch of folks from the administration, and 4 days later, Trump offered to buy Greenland. So I take a little bit of credit for delivering that humor to the world, but it has come back to the fore, and he is talking about it again
Just in the last week.
just in the last week. So one of the things that I found fascinating, and maybe you could give some commentary on this, is the U.S., similar to other developed nations, has developed this sort of parochialism and what not in my backyardism, where we all want the fruits of complex critical mineral supply chains, phones, and all the great technology stuff we have, but people are highly resistant to allowing mines to happen right here in their backyard. And so, has that been? Am I first off? Do you think I'm accurate in that assessment that the U.S. has fallen behind in mining because of that, or is there some other cause? Or your thoughts on just generally that idea would be
Okay,
valuable.
competitiveness of U.S. In mine development and
Yeah,
mining.
exactly.
Uh, I'm an academic, so I almost am naturally predisposed not to think that there's a simple answer to any question, but multiple things are at work here. And certainly
Yep.
one is that as population has grown and people have moved into what were previously remote and pristine areas, as incomes have increased and there are sources of mineral resources and materials from a distance to a greater degree than was true maybe 50 years ago, as transportation costs have become much lower than they were 2 generations ago. The the challenges of developing new mineral deposits in the United States have increased significantly, and as has been widely discussed, uh, the permitting uh, process is, it's unpredictable, mostly in terms of how long it's going to take and how long will the post decision record of decision uh, decisions be open to challenge.
And it varies state by state, right?
And it
Michigan
very,
is classic for that wonderfully rich nickel ore deposit up, north of Detroit that has taken like 20 years to get permitted, whereas you can, theoretically open a mine faster in Nevada or Arizona. Is the state by state issue a really big one?
state by state is important, and most or importantly because of different land ownerships. In much of the western United States, the federal government owns and administers much of the land. I don't quote me on the statistics, but I think the state of Nevada is 90% federal land.
Yeah, well, that is
Uh,
that is certainly true. Is West of the Rockies,
and
you're looking at crazy amounts owned by the feds. Yeah,
yeah, and so that leads to a much greater federal presence and involvement in decision making. And sometimes that, it's a messy process to gather and review uh, all the input from the various interested parties. But you also have state lands, which often are different. There's private lands. And it's just a complicated process in terms of land ownership. If we wanted to keep things simpler, one could, I'm not suggesting we do this, but in many, if not most countries, uh, the government basically owns the rights to the subsurface everywhere, uh,
right.
regardless of who owns the surface, and that allows for a different type of process. So for sure, it has become challenging to open a new greenfields mine in the United States. Uh, and we're probably ahead of the world
Why?
with that, but it, but it's becoming more challenging. I would say everywhere in the world, and it's not just government, but it's the local communities and the people in the region of
Yeah,
development that have, you know, in many cases because of problems associated with past mineral development, have become more vocal about either objection to new mines or become more vocal about the need for them to be involved as a full partner, maybe not in a legal sense, but a full partner emotionally, if you will, in terms of the decisions about whether and if so, how to mine. There was something in the news just in the last day or so about a new iron and copper mine in Chile, which was denied its permits. It was the third time it's been denied, and it's because of, as I understand it, principally because of proximity to a national park with penguin populations that are, and other wildlife and aquatic populations are at risk. So it's not just a U.S. issue, even
yeah.
though maybe it's more extreme here.
Do you think I'm always an optimist in the sense that I'm always inclined to think that kind of more education is better, right? Because when I look at, um, I'm curious about your thoughts about this. My reaction has been seeing a lot of the anti-mining zealots, it's a loaded word, but anti-mining constituencies are very clever in their use of imagery. right? So when someone is complaining today about, say, mountaintop removal in West Virginia, which calls to mind the idea of, lopping off the beautiful heads of the Rockies and filling in valleys, where in reality you're dealing with this horribly undulating landscape that's a nightmare that would be improved by smoothing in many places. And then they show a picture of, those three famous kids who were like between 6 and 10 who were coal miners in 1890, right? So they showed that image, which has nothing to do with modern mining practices whatsoever, but they're able to create this picture of this horribly abusive system that, as you know, doesn't exist. I've been in West Virginia coal mines where you could eat a sandwich off the floor, they're so clean at this point. So do you think that the mining industry is just kind of really bad at PR? Is that part of it, or is that just kind of my perception?
I think there certainly is room for companies and the industry as a whole to be better in terms of the way they communicate with the various interested parties, both nationally and in particular circumstances. Certainly part of it is image, but I think we should be careful not to uh, think about the challenges with new mineral development as simply one of image, but there are, because that can very easily come across as being dismissive. Uh,
It's true.
Christopher, if you just were a little smarter, you'd recognize that mining is
Yeah,
good.
right. If you just
Uh,
knew this better, you wouldn't be so dumb.
it,
Help me have you not be so dumb.
that's right. So that but
Yeah. And there are
I fully
concerns about where slag heaps are going to go and roads and impact and all that. There absolutely are, right? But
absolutely,
there's
and one
impact to
has
all human development. And I'm so fascinated by mining just hits people sort of different than saying, I'm going to put up a new shopping mall and a new, 600 unit apartment high rise. Well, that causes displacement too, but there's something about mining that just seems to really drive people crazy. And maybe because mining companies historically have been bad actors in various places and they haven't paid attention to waste heaps. I don't know. I mean, it's hard because knowing the mining companies that I've worked with and the close attention paid and the amount of money spent on safety, environmental care, all that sort of stuff, that just doesn't seem to get conveyed. And maybe it's just this, it's an inevitable sort of dialogue that we
Oh,
just live with.
I would say the standards of the expectations have changed, and
Mm,
certainly the overall company performance in terms of the environment and in terms of interactions with local communities has improved significantly. They are less paternalistic, more willing, and I would say even eager to engage with local populations. But it's a continuing uh, challenge, and it's one that we have to overcome as we face the inevitable increases in demand for
yeah,
minerals and mineral derived materials. And it comes to, and this has been highlighted by a much greater priority that people today are giving to domestic production because of concerns about geopolitical risks. I mean, for most of my professional life, the view was these are world markets. We should take advantage of good, high quality ore deposits elsewhere because they provide cheaper minerals. Security of supply, by and large, has not been an issue, but even though some people have been talking about this for a while, it
yeah.
was really the pandemic related supply chain shortages across the economy, as well as growing tensions between China and the United States and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine that focused our attention on geography.
Happens if I can't get what I need. Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Even though to date, you'd be hard pressed to find many examples where a manufacturer of copper wire couldn't get the copper or so on. I mean, there are individual stories, but as a general rule, that's not been a problem. But there's the fear that that could happen in the
And it could
future.
happen. And a lot of saber rattling too. And the Chinese, they also had an asymmetric view of the world where they decided from Deng Xiaoping onwards that rare earths were going to be what they dominated. And so you actually had some kind of international participants who were hewing to a mercantilist model that Europeans and Americans had given up on largely by the early 1900s. Um, so the focus was different. But I had one phenomenally, I don't know if funny is the right word, but we were speaking with a big European manufacturer that needed a lot of rare earth components for what they did. That's general enough. And in true, very excellent fashion, like their engineers and their risk management, and the CFO, they were perfectly happy that they had, I think, three or four different suppliers for what they needed. And when we went and probed on that a little harder, all four of those purveyors of those materials were buying from one supplier in China. So in reality, they were paying for fake diversification, making themselves feel falsely comfortable, but they weren't achieving it. Um, and that's just the push and pull of markets, right? And I'm curious as to as an academic and as to what you've been, what you research and what you teach and who you work with. Have you gotten a sense that companies are far more preoccupied with this concern in the last 10 years than they were before? Is that really your kind of general idea that before this they weren't that concerned and now suddenly it's like, wow, what if I can't get the praseodymium I need?
I think absolutely the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, are much more concerned about their supply chains, not just for rare earths, but for other mineral derived raw materials than they were overall, pre-pandemic, pre-Russia invasion of the Ukraine. It was quite convenient to rely on production from China when Chinese companies were the low-cost providers. Uh, Life is good, and we
Yeah,
benefit.
great.
I mean, and that's kind of the rationale, broadly speaking, behind globalization has been let's buy from the low-cost source, and all of us as customers, and we all are customers in one way or another. We benefit because we save money in buying these things, which means we have more money to use for other purposes. And the seller benefits, the buyer benefits, and the whole system is more efficient. Uh, but you have
There's
to
always a concern.
balance, there's the balance between low cost and appropriate risk. Uh, and
Something
arguably,
very cheap is suddenly very expensive if you can't get it. Right?
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And people have just, I would say, gradually between about 2005, 2007 or so, and 2020, people were beginning to be a little more concerned about it. As I said, gradually, but the 2020, the pandemic related supply chain shortages, that accelerated. Like in many, the we had an acceleration of the reassessment of remote working.
Yeah,
We
isn't
also had
it?
an
Very well
acceleration
put.
in the reconsideration of supply chains. And I would say, with respect to rare earths and magnets, that's a little bit behind the scenes, I would say, from the general public. But there's been a lot of prominence given to the various battery material supply chains for batteries of all types, for vehicles, and also stationary storage of batteries, and where we're going to get our lithium and how expensive will it be, and not just where is the lithium being produced as a raw material, but where is it being processed, and how safe is that? How safe is the supply chain? And so you've seen automobile companies enter into purchase agreements uh, with mining companies. Now, we think that there are probably 6, 7 stages in the supply chain between the automobile company and the
Oh yeah.
mine. And 10 years ago, roughly and in general, uh, the OEMs, the manufacturers, they said, well, we have suppliers. They are responsible for managing their commercial risks, and that
Yep.
goes eventually to the mine. And our
That has
suppliers,
changed significantly. I mean, as a mining executive, the number of
yep,
conversations I had in the last 3 years with, finished product companies, aerospace, automotive,
yep.
medical technology. Yeah, I think, Frank, it's a salutary development, I think, right? For people
Oh
to
no,
think more deeply
absolutely.
about their supply chains and their actual risks. I think it's actually a great thing that they're paying attention.
No, I think absolutely. And while the system was in steady state and working smoothly, you could kind of
Yeah.
not
Why
keep your
bother?
eye
Why
on
get
it.
involved?
No, that's right.
Right.
There were other. So yes, I think
Ah,
that's certainly true.
it's kind of separate but related, right? Because the future is always the kids. Have you seen in the course of your career? Have you seen sort of a difference in the preoccupations or the focus of the students coming through the college, or is because it's a mining school to begin with? Not much has changed in terms of how the students were coming in or looking at their careers, or has there been any sort of shift in emphasis in what they look at? I'm kind of fascinated. I've got no idea.
I think times are always evolving and changing. And I started out as an academic in the mid 1980s. And so that was a period of time when I think most students, again, it's a generalization, all
Sure.
generalizations are false. Uh,
But
the,
helpful. False, but
it-
helpful.
that's right, first approximations.
Yep.
Uh, and as a first approximation in the 1980s, students were very career oriented. I think there'd been a period of time of high inflation in the late 70s, early 80s. And so there was, I would say, a very focused careerism overall that was maybe less true in the 1990s. It became very true again, this focus on what sort of job am I going to get for my education post the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Now I think more recently there's there's still that, and this is in an engineering school. Engineering is going to you're being educated to become an engineer.
Yep.
And Colorado School of Mines is a University of Engineering and Applied Science, so we don't get typical of the liberal arts, that study
You're not
history.
getting a lot of comparative poets who are navel
Well,
gazing.
well, well, that's right. Now we do have, I would say, excellent coursework and programs in that area, but it's not the university's niche. Today, I think what students are also perhaps looking for more than much of my career is the ability to contribute beyond their narrow, their narrow professional performance or career. So is there a higher goal in addition to having a job that they can believe they are pursuing? And I think it is true, at least with many students, that there's more attention paid to mineral resources because of concerns about the priorities toward increasing over time renewable energy. So a gradual transition away from fossil fuels, which will take decades, and a gradual replacement with wind, solar, and other technologies, carbon capture and storage. And so we have a linking of mineral resources with evolving and changing technologies, which are good for the world, that I think are motivating students to a larger degree than maybe was true in the 80s and 90s. But the 80s and 90s were several decades ago, and while I think my memory is really, really good,
Yep.
I may be engaged in revisionist history here.
It is interesting. There were, I don't know if you have these statistics to just top of your head, but there there's an efflorescence of mining education in like the 30s, 40s, and 50s that sort of ebbed off for a while.
Yep.
Um, has the curve gone back up? Has there been a resurgence in interest in numbers of students, or has it kind of remained this steady state over the course of your career?
I think at Colorado School of Mines, and I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, so I'm just as an impression that we have this number of students studying mining engineering has not changed all that much over time. Now, within the United States, and I think in Canada as well, the number of universities offering mining engineering degrees has fallen. So we've
Small. There used to be
we've
like 20 in 1950, right? And they're like
that's right. And now I
three or
think
four now, or
well, I think there are 13 engineering accredited universities in the United States offering mining engineering. Uh, where I think there almost is a greater risk is in mineral processing and extractive metallurgy, uh, which is a little more, beyond the mine. What happens after you do physical crushing and grinding, but before you get to converting up through and making metal, for example?
yep.
Uh, I think there's been a resurgence in demand for that, and the market has been slow to catch up.
That's one of the things I am fascinated by because I am by nature a free market, free choices, free will
Yep.
provides better outcomes, right? Just in general, in life, that's generally true. I contrast that with the occasional successes of a command and control economy like the Chinese have currently, the Communist Party, where they are churning out dozens of PhDs in material science, on a weekly basis out of their university system, which is a deliberate choice they have made, right? They have said our industrial policy rests upon being the manufacturing arm of the world, and they've been fairly good at that. Um, and I don't like it when the US or another free country decides to say, well, we're going to subsidize this type of education over that. I just don't like those distortions. But yet, it seems to me that was a massive demand and decades long demand in what you're talking about. There hasn't been that core reaction sufficiently in the US. Like if you're a young person getting out with a master's degree in metallurgy or refinery processing, like you can write your ticket for your career at this point.
Absolutely.
And why hasn't that happened? Is it not marketed enough? Do the kids don't get the data? Like, what's the gap there? Because the biggest question dealing as an investment banker between investors and mining companies is they've already got the answers about okay, here's the location, that's the kind of rock, I know how much it costs to get out. Okay, wonderful. Now you turn to a concentrate. After the concentrate, now what? Is the biggest question everyone asks.
Yep.
And for half the mineral types, there isn't a good answer yet. It would seem to be a market inefficiency. I mean, what are your thoughts on why that might be?
Yeah, I don't have a simple answer for that.
I was hoping you did.
I think gradually the spotlight has been shown on mineral processing and extractive metallurgy. Ultimately, I believe the market will work, but I would say the key argument in favor of a more targeted industrial policy with respect to education and training is that we don't have time for the market to do its magic because of the urgency associated with, in this case, producing more process engineers, and therefore maybe a little more, call it subsidization or incentivizing of particular sectors. And it pains me to have to say that because I, as a professional economist, raised in not a cartoon, what I would call not a cartoon version of economics. The market is always good. My general view or starting point is government should focus on establishing the framework in which the market can decide
Yeah.
how to allocate investment,
Get out of the way. Yeah, absolutely.
except when there are systematic failures. So there has to be, for national defense, there needs to be, special arrangements. We need government intervention to counteract the environmental externalities that will lead to more pollution than would be socially optimal and things like that. But I have to kind of pause when it comes to policies that direct
Well,
billions
here's kind of
towards.
how I thread that needle, right? Is that especially in Florida, they're very good at this. A lot of so here on the Space Coast, for example, a lot of aerospace companies, NASA, a lot of science, space-based stuff, and there have been very successful collaborations between companies and local community colleges. Like so, I think that's an easier sort of fit where a community college will get a grant from Leonardo Aerospace or Embraer or anyone to say, look, if you have a 2-year program in specialization in machine tool manufacturing and CNC, and there's a certificate program in that, I'll hire everyone you generate, right? And so I've seen that work really well. There seems to be something about sort of bigger scale refining processes that somehow, for whatever reason, haven't lent themselves to that. I think in Texas, in Houston, and a couple of colleges, they've been pretty good at that for the oil business. Um, but there's still this gap, right? It's not. I've got teenage children, and so speaking to them and their friends about what they're looking to focus on, no one said mining yet, right? So
I mean, in that part, in part at least, I think it's a lifestyle issue, and if you've not grown up in a reasonably remote mining town, not that all mines are remote, but it's I think many teenagers, uh, they're more attracted to an urban environment where there are lots of people, a diversity of activities and cultural opportunities,
sure,
and it's a
yeah, part of it.
challenge to, you know, for many at least, not
Hmm.
all. And I think that's an important barrier to recruiting
Hmm.
people into the mining and metallurgy sector.
Oh, true. Yeah, that's true.
Now,
It's
I think
yeah,
you talked about earlier about not in my backyard, that mentality. Well, there are a number of mining individuals or groups who are now trying to redirect the conversation around the phrase, yes, in my backyard. Uh, and trying to tell it in a positive sense that in the United States, we know how to mine in a way that
cleanly,
appropriately
right? Yeah.
protects the environment. We know how to interact with local communities in a productive way. If we source our minerals from, name, a poor, unstable country without even that may have environmental laws, but they're not enforced.
You
Think
can
about,
almost guarantee the kids are in that mine living, working in unsafe
well, that's
circumstances. So it
right.
would be
That's
better to
right.
have it here, right?
So we should aspire to produce the minerals. And I think there's something to this argument. We could develop that story
It's a good
a
story. I
little
mean, and
bit.
that's part of what I found. I love the industry, and it's coming up from the financial side, of course. It's very different. Most miners. I had to learn that if I was going to go meet miners, I should make sure I wasn't wearing cufflinks. That these are very practical people who are building real businesses out of real stuff. Um, I'm glad to hear that's kind of a trend because that is a very positive thing, right? I mean, and the thing that I have found most sort of fascinating is that legacy, maybe cultural memory of what mining always meant, right? But they remember the abuses. They remember that you all know that picture of the kids with the lunchbox covered in coal dust, right? From 1890. And that image is still there. I actually had one of the kind of most fascinating moments. very briefly is they do these tech meetups where the people come, they talk about tech, and this one thing happened to be about the impact of autonomous vehicles on urban design. Because that was the idea. So a bunch of teams came from different universities. They presented to this big crowd in New York of like 2,000 people, sitting next to this woman, probably in her 40s, who was sort of cheering for one of the teams from one of the universities. The only reason that matters is this is about industrial design. So turns out she's a professor of industrial design at a very renowned university in New York, and one of her teams is up there. So we're chatting during the break, and she says, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I finance mines." And she said to me, "How do you live with that?" I looked at her and said, "How do I live with the thousands of jobs we create? How do I live with the nations we support? How do I live with the taxes that are produced? How do I live with the fact that none of the stuff we're sitting on or the phone you're holding would exist without mining? I sleep like a baby." What was astonishing was no one had ever presented that perspective to her. She wasn't a professor of comparative French poetry. She was a professor of industrial design who believed that mining was evil. It was one of the weirdest conversations I've
Well,
ever had.
and that there's that, I would say, presumption uh, in many people. We I didn't know we still did mining, uh, sort of thing. And so there is an, as you pointed out 30 minutes ago, there is an education element here um, that's part of the solution, where the industry, I think, sometimes has stumbled in this regard is that uh, I think almost every industry, many industries seem to or tend to think that they are underappreciated. That if only the public had a better idea of where their food came from,
Man.
or where their Patagonia vests came from, the world would be a better place. And so that's part of the issue.
Yeah.
But it's more than just that. I think but you're right. That conversation is quite revealing and indicates that there's still more work to be done, and why I think organizations like ICMM, the International Council on Mining and Metals, is performing an invaluable service for the sector by emphasizing uh, the need for mining to become more consistent with, I think, in their words, sustainable development. And it's sustainable development. It's not remaining the same. It's development, but done in a way that's sustainable, and recognizing that the industry there needs to be continuous improvement, that there are always opportunities for improvement.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks for your thoughts. Is there any sort of burning issue that if you had that magic wand to wave that people would understand about mining better? Is there one sort of main thing, or is it just I'm being too reductionist? It's just not that simple.
Yeah, the I would say for me, minerals are fascinating to think about. If you look at the periodic table of elements
Yep.
and the minerals that from which these elements are derived, to think about the ways in which engineers have designed materials to take advantage of the chemical properties. And
That's
the final,
huge.
now, I've had to ramble on for 30 seconds while thinking about what I really wanted to say. There's an expression that someone once used maybe a decade ago. The periodic table is under siege. And now many of your listeners may not only vaguely remember what the periodic table is. Uh, but there are basically 80 some chemical elements that materials engineers have at their disposal to design flat panel touchscreen displays and various types of modern engineered materials. 30 or 40 years ago, probably 15 or 20 of those 80 constituted the vast majority of uh, chemical elements used in modern engineered materials at the time. So the early smartphones, maybe 20-ish elements, maybe 30. Don't want to argue about the details. Today, a typical smartphone uses somewhere between 60 and 70 of those 80 elements. So a smartphone, in this
Yeah.
case, an Apple iPhone, basically it's the periodic table of elements. And most of the elements are used in really, really small quantities. But without those small quantities, we wouldn't have the smartphone would not be, oh, it's a phone. I hardly ever use it as a phone. It's a camera. It's a way to access email. It's a way to get onto the internet.
Have you got this great new app on his phone that lets him make phone calls?
Yeah, that's right. I hardly ever use it as a phone. Uh,
The
so,
periodic table is under siege. That's a great phrase.
so
I like
anyway,
that.
that's my thought.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And thing that I always refer to, we're speaking was sort of trying to bridge the gap and understand between investors, many of whom were liberal arts majors, and trying to understand like what can be done. I always refer to sort of the platonically ideal engineering solution, right? Given no constraints, right? Here is your table of elements. Here are the ingredients you've got to build thing X. Absent cost constraints and availability, how would you build that? And it's an instructive exercise I found to say, okay, now layering cost constraints. How much does that change? Because when you create abundance where there used to be scarcity, everyone, of course, knows that a long time ago, aluminum was more valuable than gold and platinum, right? And now you wrap corn in it, put it on the grill, and toss it when you're done. So clearly something changed, and it wasn't the chemical property; it was the availability and cost.
Yep.
Um, so I like that. I think we're gonna title this the periodic table is under siege. I appreciate that. That's
Okay.
fantastic. But Rod, thank you so much for taking the time. Deeply appreciate it. Hopefully you get some skiable snow shortly. Uh, and you're
That's a bit
always welcome back whenever you get time.
very good. Thank you very much, Christopher. It's been great to talk with you today.
Thanks a lot.